Great. Thanks everyone for being here today and coming along to the Shaw Library. It's very nice to be here. And thanks to Rose for the invite to be part of the Showcase series. When Rose initially contacted me and suggested that I come and discuss some of my work, it was actually in relation to a rather larger project that I have had in progress for a number of years. But I thought as I was putting something together for this, that it might be more interesting, certainly for me, but hopefully also for you, if I were to talk instead about some work in progress, so some work that I'm still undertaking and that's unfolding at the moment. So in what follows today, in my discussion of medical influencers, I'll tell you a little bit about how it is that I alighted on this topic, why it is that I think it's of interest, so why should we be studying this, particularly from my own field of media and communications, and then I'll tell you a little bit about what my early findings are. So for the past several years, I've been studying the emergence of wellness culture as a novel cultural formation and commercial development in the UK context. And I'm very much concerned in this regard with discourses and practices and products around healthy eating. And my initial attention was really drawn to this by the large following that a small but very recognizable number of young women influencers started to find in the mid-2010s, so around 2015, 2016, garnering these really large followings on Instagram in particular, promoting healthy eating, promoting new ways of eating that are supposedly better for one's health, in particular through a kind of whole food, plant-based diet. And there are a number of figures who kind of exemplify this trend, of which Deliciously Ella, who you see here on screen, is just one. And these women were not only finding large followings on social media, but they were also being spotlit by the broader media in the UK context, really held up as exemplars, women who are inspirational in a variety of regards, not only because they have managed to take their health into their own hands and very often recover from various kinds of illnesses and ailments, but also because they're entrepreneurial and because they're spreading this message to the UK more broadly, to the UK public. And Ella in particular has been credited with supposedly having changed the way a generation eats, and she's achieved a great deal of recognition in that regard. So in seeing these women come to prominence in the media, I've been interested in not only the kind of aspirational economies of social media, the kinds of lifestyles that we see portrayed on Instagram, but also the more mundane entanglements that these may generate in the context of women's day-to-day lives. So thinking about who are the followers of these kinds of people and what is it that they get from this kind of content. So in this regard, I embarked on a larger project, as I've said, which was a multi-sided ethnography, bringing together media analysis, looking at social media content, but also looking at cookbooks and podcasts and a whole variety of promotional materials that these figures make available. But also doing participant observation, going to the kinds of events that they speak at, which might be panel discussions in high-end groceries and food festivals at big expo centres in the UK and in London in particular, and also doing interviews with people who are involved in this sphere, both as influencers and content creators themselves, but also as more ordinary participants, ordinary adherents, people who are trying to model these lifestyles and put into practice the kind of tips and advice that they make available. And in pursuing this kind of multi-sided ethnography, I very much took inspiration from the idea of a multi-sided project bent on following connections. As George Marcus says, following connections, associations, and putative relationships. And in the course of undertaking this research, I came to see that medical doctors are very central to existing wellness networks in the UK context, both online and offline. And yet these figures aren't really present in the quite extensive by now media and communications literature that has amassed on the topic of wellness influencers. So there's very little research on medical influencers, these kinds of figures who operate in this sphere, despite the fact that there is growing attention from the media, so commentary in newspapers, for example, but also in academic medicine and in other professional fora, there's growing commentary on the status of doctors who are becoming celebrities via social media. And the reason I thought it was interesting that they're absent from the literature and media communications on wellness influencers is in part because it's not simply that they're not recognized. That in and of itself might be understandable as a kind of, this is a relatively new phenomenon, a new development. But more than this, some of the common claims in literature on wellness influencers actually makes these figures difficult to see at all. So one of the core contentions within existing literature on wellness influencers is that these people lack accredited expertise. They do not have credentials in the topics about which they dispense advice, including and in particular food and diet. And in this regard then, wellness influencers who are medically credentialed, who do have this form of authoritative expertise, are almost a contradiction in terms, or can't be seen at all. And one of the reasons that I think this is interesting and important is because it leads to a situation whereby wellness influencers who are assumed to be unaccredited, who are assumed to be, if anything, simply lay experts drawing on their own personal experience, means that there is a figuration of these figures as in various ways problematic. So it's a problem, it's figured as a problem in and of itself that wellness influencers lack accredited expertise, particularly in relation to concerns around misinformation and disinformation. You know, it would be understandable that they might give the wrong kind of advice or make mistakes because they don't have expertise. But it's also seen as begetting further problems. So again, this idea of wellness influencers as a kind of vector for misinformation. And also, it's very often claimed that the popularity of these conventional wellness influencers who don't have accredited expertise indexes a kind of broader problematic in society at large, a kind of public mistrust in experts generally and medical professionals in particular. And in this regard, the advent of medical influencers, when they have been recognized, including in media commentary, as I've suggested, they are figured in quite positive terms. And some references I've heard have been the idea of medical influencers as a kind of remedy for the times, particularly around health information, which became a big issue in the context of COVID, and further, a means to fight fire with fire. So there are these conventional wellness influencers who are in various ways spreading misinformation online, but if we have these credentialed figures, they will provide a means to fight fire with fire, to combat misinformation. And in my view, this kind of recourse to credentials, this kind of credentialism and investment in credentialism can be seen to reflect what Heidi Zimmerman has termed a class anxiety about threats to credentialed expertise in the digital age, alongside fears about feminized media culture. So these kinds of fears around feminized culture, feminized media culture, have been very prominent in a lot of writing on wellness more broadly. So in order to try and study these figures in their own terms, I've turned to developing a kind of a sub-project, a sub-stream of research within this broader ethnography, this multi-sited ethnography, taking a number of case studies. And in doing so, I've been informed by the work of a colleague of mine here at LSE, Lily Hulu-Iraqi, and what she terms the merit of example, whereby specific case studies are chosen because they demonstrate a kind of regularity in their features. With the case studies that I'm about to introduce to you, the common feature, something that they all have, that they all share, is this investment in food, in nutrition, and in lifestyle more broadly as the means to gain good health. And they also should demonstrate, Hulu-Iraqi suggests, a systemacity in their effects. And that's also something that I'm going to try and point out and suggest when I come to the case studies. So because this is a kind of subcomponent of the broader ethnography, it's included a range of different kinds of materials, most especially Instagram content, but also looking at books, apps, podcasts, newsletters, public appearances. And one of the core questions that I've been asking in this regard is, what difference do credentials really make? So wellness influencers, conventional wellness influencers who are without accredited expertise are variously problematized. There's an idea that if we have people who are medically accredited, it will make a difference somehow to the kind of content that they produce. So the question I've been asking myself is, well, what difference does it really make? So I have two things that I want to highlight in this regard, and I'll come on just first to tell you about my case studies. So going from left to right here, we have Dr. Rupi Ojla of the Doctor's Kitchen, Professor Tim Spector, based over the road at King's College London, who is one of the co-founders of personalized nutrition company Zoe. And then to the far right, we have the food medic, Dr. Hazel Wallace, aka the food medic. Can I just ask briefly, is anyone familiar with any of these individuals? Have you come across them in any way? Okay, some hands going up, some nods. I would say that I would guess, based on my own media engagement, that Tim Spector is probably in particular quite well known, or is the most likely to be known to you, not only because he has a large following on social media, but also because he's becoming a bit of a fixture in a broader media circuit concerned with questions of health and diet. So he's very often on Radio 4, for example. He's recently done a big documentary for the BBC on ultra-processed foods. So he's gaining a lot of exposure that way. So all of these figures, I want to suggest and argue, even though they have this broader media profile, they have podcasts, they have best-selling books, they're on the radio and television and so forth, but they're also influencers. And how and why can I say this? Well, first of all of them, all three, have sizable Instagram followings, ranging from around 300,000 to around 700,000, which, according to industry standards, categorizes them as mid-tier influencers. They also utilize established conventions that are well known from the wellness industry, such as, in the middle here, what I eat in a day videos, which Tim Spector is doing here. They also collaborate with very high-profile wellness proponents. For example, the aforementioned Deliciously Ella has a podcast on which Tim Spector has appeared 3 times already to date. They feature on the same circuit of speaking events as conventional influencers. They produce books and apps and podcasts that are classified as wellness content by major platforms such as Amazon and iTunes. They engage in brand partnerships and produce sponsored content, which is a core characteristic of influencing, as denoted as well by a government inquiry into influencer culture that took place recently. So they have this kind of commercial remit. And they're also represented by influencer agents and talent managers. So they have all the kinds of characteristics that we would expect of influencers, and yet they're not necessarily always recognized as such. It's also important to say that none of these are new arrivals to the wellness scene. They all have a long-standing following. Wallace and Ojla both released books in 2017 when a lot of other wellness influencers who are beginning to find broader mainstream media attention also were releasing books, and they released them also under the same titles and with the same publishers. And yet, despite this centrality, despite the fact that they've been there and they've been at the center of many of these networks, they haven't really been recognized or accounted for within this literature on wellness influencers. So with this question in mind then, of what difference do credentials make? Let me turn to the first of my 2 initial findings. And again, these are early findings, but I think they tell us something quite interesting. So the first I'm titling plastic professionalism. So what do I mean by this? Within the accounts that these 3 figures give of why they have come to believe that food is medicine, and that is the credo that they stick to. That is a long-standing credo within wellness more generally. Food is medicine, and when they state it, it very likely comes across as a literal statement of fact because they are medical doctors, so that's not just conventional wisdom. So in coming to this idea that food is medicine, it's very much about their personal experience of having faced a health crisis and then overcome it themselves, often at a distance from, or even turning down or disengaging with conventional medical treatment. So the authorizing narratives then that they deploy rehearse the same kinds of scripts that conventional wellness influencers deploy, i.e., I experienced this health crisis, and then I overcame it by myself, doing various research and experimenting with food and diet until I achieved a better health. So personal experience then is very, very central. Somewhat differently from conventional wellness influencers, given their professionalism and their credentials, medical training is framed as both a resource and a barrier to knowledge on how to be well. So there's commentary on how their medical training has equipped them with the skills of research that are very, very useful in trying to decipher how to eat well and how to be well. But it's also framed as a barrier to knowing this in a more intuitive way. So becoming overly steeped in Western Orthodox biomedicine and not, for example, taking on board or giving greater consideration to Ayurvedic tradition, which is something that Rupi Ojla talks about a great deal. Also, in a lot of their narratives and self-presentation, the authority of other medics and or medicine in general is routinely called into question. Tim Spector in particular is very critical of GPs and the GP health system, often calls into question the the status of medicine as being able to actually deal with various forms of chronic disease in particular, on the basis that lifestyle isn't given enough attention and centrality, and that GPs aren't really equipped to offer lifestyle advice. So all three call medicine into question and call the practice of medicine into question on the basis that it's not sufficiently equipped to handle the so-called burden of lifestyle disease. Thinking again with Huliaraki's idea of what is the kind of the systemicity of effects that you might see with your case studies, my suggestion in relation to this kind of plastic professionalism whereby credentials are invoked and they are leveraged, they're very much there in the narrative, and they're very much figured visually also, for example, through the use of the stethoscope in promotional and publicity pictures. And yet at the same time, even though credentials are leveraged in various ways, there's also this calling into question of medicine more generally. And one of the possible implications of this, and a somewhat ironic one given this idea that medical influencers are well positioned to fight fire with fire and combat misinformation and restore trust in the medical profession, is actually that they may in fact further undermine this mistrust on the basis that they're saying, don't trust doctors generally, trust me specifically. A second area that I think is very interesting, and one of the findings that I want to highlight, is in relation to the actual contents of the dietary prescriptions that they make available. So all three of these individuals are very focused on the actual contents of eating well. How exactly should people eat? And this is very obviously the case with Ojla and with Wallace because they have cookbooks. They've sold a number of different cookbooks. But even Tim Spector, who suggests that he doesn't really want to tell anyone how to eat, nevertheless has the kind of rules that you must follow, and then composes content such as What I Eat in a Day videos, which are very clearly directional. This is what I eat in a day, this is the good way, this is the best way to eat. So they are offering various kinds of dietary prescriptions. And again here, from reading the kind of content of those dietary prescriptions alongside those offered by conventional wellness influencers, the degree of familiarity and overlap and continuity is very, very striking. So there's this ethos that people need to go back to basics, that we need to make the right choices, that eating in a healthy way is delicious, but also that nutrition is a constant imperative, it must always be planned for, that we need to find balance. The contents themselves are very much centered on a whole food and plant-based ethos. This is the same kind of logic that we see with conventional wellness influencers, not necessarily vegan, but very much veg first and veg focused. Also ideas about eating in a way that is real and that is natural. And yet after this, which is, for anyone who's familiar with dietary logics, this ethos of whole food plant-based is not really that far away from the Mediterranean diet. After this broad consensus is achieved, we then see myriad points of conflict and contradiction over the finer details. And so there's what I would consider a kind of Freudian narcissism of small differences, where small issues, what might be considered small issues, are to be endlessly debated upon. So supplementation, for example, is something that these figures vociferously disagree with one another on. Also the relative importance of weight and BMI as indicators of health. Also the importance of eating organic or not. So there are numerous points of conflict and contradiction. And so if you were to follow their content and compare it to one another, you would find that you might be in a position of actually not really coming away with much of a clearer sense about what to eat. And so in this regard, I think that one of the ultimate effects of these influencers and the kind of content they make available may be to reproduce rather than resolve what has been termed dietary cacophony. This sense that there's just so much information about how and why we should eat. You know, media headlines that red wine is good for you, no it's terrible. Chocolate is good for you, no it's terrible. The sense that we don't really know how to eat because we're getting so many different messages that it creates this sense of noise. My sense is that these figures in kind of feeding into this noise might be reproducing rather than resolving it by simply kind of telling us, no, there's just this one good way to eat. So those are two of my findings then from the research that I've undertaken thus far. So some final points to make. Why do I think that credentials don't make that much of a difference or enough of a difference? There are a couple of key points here. First of all, it's that influencing we have to recognize as being a fundamentally promotional activity. There are various things that are being promoted here. The self is being promoted as an individual entity. There's a certain kind of message and agenda that's being promoted. There's also various products being promoted, so there's a commercial orientation. So it's a fundamentally promotional activity. And also, in order to gain and maintain visibility, as we know from the much wider literature on influencing generally, people need to adhere to certain kinds of logics. And these are very much dictated by the platforms on which they're operating. So some of these that have been highlighted by scholars in media and communications more generally, first of all, the need to cultivate a distinctive self-brand, to be saying something that seems unique. If these figures were simply rehearsing public health guidelines and advice, I don't think they would gain the followings that they do. There's an idea and a sense that the information and advice that they're offering is unique and idiosyncratic. You wouldn't find it elsewhere. They also need to appear authentic and relatable. Authenticity has been understood as the core construct and central currency of the influencer industry. And this is why I think we see this recourse to very personal stories of healing, of health crisis and recovery, because it's a way of appearing authentic and making oneself relatable to a wide audience, particularly those who may be seeking this kind of content because they are experiencing health problems of one kind or another. And finally, then, the need to navigate algorithmic opacity. Not being very clear as a content creator or as a would-be influencer what will work on the platform on any given day, in part because algorithms often change in terms of what kinds of hierarchies of visibility are made available. And so in this regard, there's often a pattern whereby if a particular kind of content does well, which is not to say that necessarily it's positively endorsed, but it gains a lot of engagement, then other influencers will respond to that in some way. So there could be a post one day about the benefits of milk and dairy made by one influencer. That does very, very well, gains a lot of engagement. The next day, another influencer will post about why dairy is absolutely verboten, should not be consumed, is not healthful, and so forth. And in this way, it's a way of kind of piggybacking on what's already working. You can see somebody else is gaining engagement from this, and so you write back in a way and are likely to gain engagement as well. So this need to navigate algorithmic opacity, producing continual content, and trying to find engagement of any kind, really. But also, and something we can't lose sight of, one of the reasons that credentials may not make enough of a difference from distinguishing wellness medfluencers from conventional unaccredited wellness influencers is that medicine itself is not a monolithic field. And so this assertion that, if simply these people were qualified, then everything would be somehow seamless or would be simply correct. But actually, there are lots of disagreements, of course, within medicine, as the adage of getting a second opinion readily attests. Doctors don't always agree, and we know that. And in this regard, it's also very important to point to the rise of lifestyle medicine as a distinct specialism, certainly within the UK context, something that's been garnering a lot of attention and also quite a bit of concern from the medical community, as seen with recent pieces in the BMJ about the rise of lifestyle medicine, for example. So finally, where do I think this leaves us? My suggestion at this point is that the kind of content that these particular individuals, who are all prominent exemplars of the category of medical influencers in the UK context, seem to extend what Michael Fitzpatrick, himself a GP and the author of this fantastic book, don't let the quite sad Routledge cover belie that to you. It's a really fantastic book, The Tyranny of Health, talks about as the regulation of lifestyle, argues that under the so-called new paradigm of health emerging from the 1990s, of which Tony Giddens here was in part involved, we see this new paradigm of health where doctors are really told that they need to focus on controlling and modifying the health behaviors of their patients. One of the problems with this, one of the reasons why I think that this should be of concern for us, is that there's not a great deal of evidence that these kinds of behavioral health promotion strategies actually work. Indeed, quite a bit of scholarship within critical public health tells us not only do they not work, but they actually have a tendency to widen health inequalities. And this is something that I think is very liable to follow with the case of medical influencers as well. Another reason that I think it's very important to attend to this is that these medical influencers are promoting an idea of personal behavioral change and individual choice, and in controlling health and individual responsibility for health in a context where the future of the NHS has already become, and is only ever more becoming, very, very precarious. And in this regard, I think it's very interesting to look at the kind of common sense around health and healthcare that these figures promote through the kind of content that they make available. And what I would be especially concerned about in that regard is this cultivation of a sense of health, not as a public good and something that we should invest in socially and that we should socialize, but instead as a private responsibility that should ultimately be wrought and attended to by individuals. That's all I have for today. Thank you very much.